Good evening. My name is Donnie Passow. I'm a rabbi here at Harvard Hillel and a Harvard chaplain. Over the past months, Israel has been engulfed in what some have called its biggest existential crisis since the Yom Kippur War. From afar, we have watched as hundreds of thousands have protested the proposed judicial overhaul. The crisis reached a temporary crescendo this week as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fired his defense minister for coming out against moving forward with the current reforms, and with Bibi ultimately pausing the process just yesterday. There's still much uncertainty in the days and weeks ahead, and we are privileged this evening to have one of our generation's finest legal minds to help us better understand the judicial crisis in Israel. Noah Feldman is best known as the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, Chairman of the Society of Fellows, and founding director of the Julis-Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli law, all here at Harvard University. He writes the New York Review of Books and was a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine for nearly a decade. Professor Feldman also hosts the Deep Background podcast and is the author of 9 books. His 10th, titled Bad Jews, A Perplexed Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People, will be out Passover 2024. However, in this building, a place where Noah grew up, he has probably more regularly been introduced as Noah Ram ben Raphael Eli Ufanina Leah. Noah, just 2 weeks ago, I was speaking at your parents' now their synagogue in New York. And for my talk on Shabbat afternoon, I wasn't wearing a tie. Noticing that I was a bit underdressed, I asked one of the rabbis if I should quickly run and put one on. He said there wasn't enough time and that it wasn't that big of a deal. I explained that in many Orthodox synagogues, it's pretty common to go tieless for Sudah Shlishit, to which he responded, not at KJ. For anyone who is familiar with that synagogue, I clearly should have known better. Just then, your father walked by, and overhearing the discussion, he grabbed me and the rabbi and said, Donnie, in solidarity with you, I'm not wearing a tie either. I share this story because when I think of the Feldmans, my own personal relationship with your family and their relationship with Harvard Hillel, I can think of countless moments like these, both big and small, in which we have felt so supported by you. Almost 3 years ago to the day, we hosted Noah in the second session of our online speaker series. With lockdowns having just begun, we were seeking a way to continue to serve our community. And in thinking about speakers to present to our students and alumni online, we knew that you would be there for us and accept our invitation. That masterful class on Passover in a time of Corona established our credibility and helped launch what has now been over 60 sessions. We were shocked then when 450 people registered for your session. Because of your support, we've been able to grow these past 3 years, and tonight we have over 1,700. Noah, thank you for all you have done for Harvard Hillel. We're all eager and excited to learn from you tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi. I am deeply honored to be here, and I have not done very much for Harvard Hillel compared to what Harvard Hillel has done for me. I am thrilled looking around the room to see students and colleagues and friends, and I'm also thrilled that, and this is a measure of how old I'm getting, that now I can be introduced to Harvard Hillel without anyone mentioning that they were there at my bris, which is something that happens a lot when I speak at Harvard Hillel. Rabbi Ben Zion Gold officiated at my parents' wedding at Harvard Hillel. There was the aforementioned ritual event that I will not allude to further. I was bar mitzvahed at Harvard Hillel. And so I owe more to this institution really than any other institution that I can think of, including the university of which it's a part, to which I owe an enormous amount. So I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I also liked your story, Donnie, about KJ, I'm just astonished that there was a story in which my father was not wearing a tie. It's very impressive. I wear mostly his ties, bought from all the great and no longer mostly existing tie stores in Harvard Square. So he has plenty to go around. So if anyone's looking for extra ties, it's the place to look. What I'd like to do in the time that we have is to try to go a step deeper than most of us been able to go in the news in thinking about the current crisis in Israel that centers around issues of judicial reform. And I really want to break my comments into three parts. In the first part, I want to explore the deeper rationale that is behind a movement that's put perhaps as much as 10% of Israel's population on the streets in recent weeks. So just to put it in comparative terms, if this were the United States, that would be 30 million people. It's a lot of people. I want to go deeper and explore just what it is that has driven people to the streets. Then I want to turn to the other point of view, to the point of view of the coalition government, the government of Israel at the moment, and explore again, I hope with greater depth than we often have time to think about, what are the issues that are driving the government? And I want to, as I will do in the first part of the comments, try to interpret charitably what their views might be. Not because I'm naive and I think that politicians always act, or the public always acts in the best of motives, but because I think it's a very useful practice in exploring a deep conflict to consider what's the most attractive, the most charitable version of the point of view of that side. And then last but not least, I want to talk about what it all means for the Jewish community around the world, for non-Jews who care a lot about what's going on in Israel for whatever reason they might care, and explore a little bit the question of where we or the world goes from here. So that's the roadmap. Now, it's kind of astonishing that this many people would be on the streets of any country arguing about proposed reforms to the high court of the country. Someone said earlier today at an event I was also speaking at Harvard Law School about this topic, that this was entirely unprecedented. And I pointed out that's not actually necessarily true. In Pakistan some years ago, there was a so-called lawyers' movement that became a national movement after the Chief Justice of their Supreme Court was booted out unceremoniously. And he eventually ended up returning to his position, and the government ultimately fell over the issue. So it's not that Israel is utterly unique in this regard, but it's certainly very unusual to see this many people on the streets around a court. So why is that happening? And that question of why it's happening is deepened when you realize that the first piece of legislation that is in front of, that was introduced by the government and that was supposed to go to its definitive reading in the legislature in the Knesset this week, addresses the question of how the justices of the Israeli High Court will be chosen. And it changes it from a system in which, and I'm going to oversimplify a bit here for conversation, in which the justices and senior figures of the legal profession, who unsurprisingly tend to do what the justices like, more or less control the process of who becomes a justice of the High Court. Now, that is an unusual, not to say outlying mechanism for choosing justices of the High Court of a country. Now, the United States is also an outlier because we got into the business of appointing an independent Supreme Court long before just about any other country did. And our system is highly politicized in the US, as you all know, and most observers around the world think ours is too politicized. But if ours is too politicized, the Israeli model is very far over on a continuum towards what you might call the independence of the profession, and what, as we'll see, critics would say is effectively self-perpetuation by an elite of judges who don't only decide cases, but also decide who's going to succeed them, right? It's almost as if you could imagine this, justice of the US Supreme Court had direct as opposed to indirect influence over who was going to fulfill their role after they left. So that alone, the idea of a change to that doesn't on the surface seem like the sort of thing that would cause a conflict or a turmoil that people on both sides have referred to, with some exaggeration, I'll return to this, as a potential civil war. And by the way, in modern Israeli Hebrew, the phrase for civil war is milchemet achim, which literally means a war of brothers, and is, if you will, an even more redolent, poignant phrase than civil war. More on that in a little bit. The reason for the intensity of public expression of emotion around this cannot even be fully explained by the combination of great popularity for about half the population and great unpopularity for about half the population of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I almost want to say the once and forever Prime Minister of Israel, but he has for some moments, for many of you in the room, there have been barely any moments in your lives when he was not the Prime Minister of Israel, whether you knew it or not. And as you know, after 5 rounds of elections, the Israeli public basically is where it was. About half the population thinks he's the best person to lead the country, and about half the population thinks he should be in prison. And that balance hasn't really shifted in any very significant way, except because of the vagaries of the Israeli electoral system, which is really a topic for the Q&A for the true electoral college and electoral design nerds, which happened in this particular round of the elections to give a slight majority to Netanyahu's coalition, mostly because of the genuinely unfortunate, that was the most diplomatic word I could come up with, self-immolation of some of the left and left-center parties. So even that can't explain it, because Netanyahu has been at the center of Israeli politics for a long time. He's been indicted. He's been voted out of office. He's been voted back into office. None of that brought people to the streets in comparable numbers. The short answer for why so many people are treating the current set of proposals and those which may come after as fundamental to the future of the state of Israel from their perspective is that they equate democracy with judicial review. Now, to say what that means, I have to start by explaining what judicial review is. I'm not going to start with what democracy is because I'm going to come back to that. The advantage is everyone in the room and everyone online thinks that you know exactly what democracy is, and some of you may be less confident you know exactly what judicial review is. So judicial review is usually the phrase that constitutional lawyers, political scientists, and others use to describe a practice where a high court of a country can rule that an action of the government, whether that's the passing of legislation or a decision by the government in the executive or administrative sphere, is unlawful and can be reversed, and that when the high court orders for it to be reversed, people will listen. And by people, I mean, in the first instance, the government itself that did that, which is supposed to back down. And in the second instance, the rest of the government. And in the third instance, the rest of the populace is supposed to acknowledge this. Now, I'm going to say more about this right now because it's so fascinating and significant. Judicial review is ordinarily, and by ordinarily, I mean in essentially every other country on earth that has judicial review, the product of some explicit legal enactment, usually a constitutional provision, that says explicitly the Supreme Court or the High Court, call it what you will, has the lawful authority to interpret and apply the Constitution so as to hold that the action of the government, again, passing a law by a majority in the legislature or taking executive action, violates the constitutional principle. And because the Constitution is a law of greater import, higher hierarchical value than an ordinary piece of legislation passed by the legislature, in a case where the two contradict each other, where the constitutional provision contradicts the law, the constitutional provision wins. And the originator in modern constitutionalism of this idea was the US Supreme Court in the famous Marbury against Madison case. There, the Constitution had never explicitly said that the Supreme Court could engage in judicial review, but the Chief Justice reasoned, and he got the agreement of the other justices of the court, that because the Constitution as a written constitution in the United States was the supreme law of the land and called itself that, it must be paramount, that was his word, over an ordinary piece of legislation, because if it weren't, it wouldn't be a constitution. And he concluded, my job as a judge is to interpret the law, and the law is telling me two different things. The Constitution is telling me one thing, and the statute is telling me something that contradicts the Constitution. I'm stuck. I have to choose between these things. Obviously, I'm going to choose the paramount one. Hence, I have the power of judicial review. And why do I get to do it? Why does the court get to do it? Because it's the judge's job. It is the province of the judiciary. It is emphatically the province of the judiciary, he said, to say what the law is. Okay, so that's the basic theory of judicial review. And it's essentially been imitated in every country on earth that now has judicial review. Israel's judicial review is not based on that same principle. And it can't be based on that same principle for the simple reason that Israel, A, doesn't have a written constitution, and B, has only a few laws, which the Knesset labels basic laws, which are meant to function as kind of rough drafts of provisions that might someday go into a constitution. And even those basic laws, mostly, there is one exception, don't explicitly say that they're empowering anybody to strike down other laws on that basis. So Israel got judicial review by a different process than essentially every other country on earth. It got judicial review because an activist Supreme Court, led by the High Court, led by the president of the court, Aharon Barak, gradually, over the course of a couple of decades, announced that it logically must have this power of judicial review, which, and I'm oversimplifying here, must exist somewhere in an independent liberal democracy. Okay? The basic idea here is that for a democracy to really be a democracy, and now you see where I'm going to come to what a democracy is. The basic idea is that for a democracy to really be a liberal democracy, one that respects rights, there must be in it some institution that has the authority to say to the legislature or the executive, and in Israel, they're more or less the same because it's a parliamentary system, to say, you got it wrong, and what you've done exceeded your authority. Now, it takes genuine genius, and Justice Barak is a genius, to come up with a theory according to which the court has the authority to do this, notwithstanding that nothing in the constitutional order authorizes it. I want to add that to supporters of the Israeli High Court, the birth of judicial review through this process has been a legitimate one. It's been around for long enough, it's operated frequently enough, and the other institutions of the Israeli government have more or less followed it, for it to feel as though now it is a part of the structure of Israeli democracy. Simultaneously to critics of Justice Barak's judicial revolution, sometimes called the Israeli Rights Revolution, it has never been legitimate. It has always been, to those critics, an act of overreach beyond the granted authority of the court. Now, how would one judge as between those? And I see that there's some hands, but if it's okay, I'll just speak for another 20, 25 minutes, and then I promise to take as many questions as you have, and I'll stay as late as it takes. I take it that a hand indicates that I failed to explain something, but that's the way these things go. I'll try to answer it later. So how could it be that the name of that the word democracy inherently incorporates this idea that there must be a judicial body that can sit in review of legislation? Now, if you had said that to the founders of the US Constitution, they would have said that's absurd. But then again, they didn't really love the word democracy. They thought they were creating a republic. And they thought the word democracy was a little too inclusive and egalitarian for their purposes. It really wasn't until the post-World War II period that countries around the world started thinking that the word democracy actually meant liberal democracy. And then it was another 20 years after that before people started thinking that liberal democracy included an independent judiciary. But once people in democratic countries, self-described democratic countries, started thinking this, they started really thinking it. And it led to some kind of shocking results, my favorite of which is, there's an institution in the United Kingdom called the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. Can anyone guess when the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom was constituted by law? Sorry, 2009, pursuant to legislation from 2005. Now, the reason that's surprising is the Supreme Court of the UK is made up of the people who used to be called the Law Lords, who belong to the House of Lords. And the House of Lords is, arguably, I think it probably is, the oldest running democratic legislative body in the world. It's more than 1,000 years old. okay? So how could it be that the United Kingdom found itself in this situation of having to discover that it now had a Supreme Court? Because in the European Union and in the broader community of democratic countries, it had become so normative by the first decade of the 21st century. So normative to say that we must have an independent judiciary to be a democracy, that the United Kingdom, which again, arguably, is the first model of a constitutional democracy in the modern world, I would plump for that view, started feeling as if, and being told, you're not actually a democracy. Because you don't formally have something called the Supreme Court, in which the members of that court are not technically also members of this legislative body, the House of Lords. So I'm using that just as an outlying example to show you just how powerful the idea became over the last 20 or 30 years, that to be a liberal democracy, you need to have an independent judicial body that can overturn the legislature. Now, did Israel's founders think this? The Declaration of Independence of Israel says that Israel shall be established as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, what the Jewish in that means is something that I'm hoping you don't even ask me in the Q&A, but I promise to answer if you do. But the democratic part certainly did not entail in their minds the idea of an independent judiciary that would have the capacity to overturn legislation, because no one really thought that that was a necessary part of liberal democracy as of 1948. So what we're seeing is a gradual transformation in the meaning of democracy. And that gradual transformation has had special power in the Israeli context because Israel, as a parliamentary democracy, consolidates a tremendous amount of power in the prime minister, who's head of the government, and operates via a coalition. And that coalition necessarily, by definition, has a majority in the Knesset. And so if that coalition decides it wants to do something, the Knesset's not going to be able to block it. So the only entity that can block it is the court. And if you further believe that liberal democracy requires some separation of powers, then without the court, you don't have any separation of powers. So at the deepest level, those who are in the streets protesting this proposal in the first instance to change the way justices are chosen, and then there would follow further legislation potentially that would make it harder for the court to overturn legislation and also make it easier for the Knesset to overturn the court if the court overturned legislation. What's motivating them is the feeling that without a strong independent judiciary with this capacity to engage in judicial review, Israel would cease to be a liberal democracy at all. It would start going down the road, famously followed in recent years by Hungary, which has become gradually less and less democratic, by Poland, ditto, in which reform of the Supreme Court or of the High Court in those countries has been a crucial step of weakening the separation of powers, weakening fundamental rights, and strengthening, in those instances, the executive branch. They would probably also associate this with what happened in India this past week, too, something that would have been on even more front pages were it not for what's going on in Israel, in which the government, the BJP government of India, ordered the arrest of Rahul Gandhi, the head of the Congress party, and charged him with an offense for which the punishment is sufficiently long, I think it's more than 2 years is the rule, to disqualify him from running for office. And for better or worse, it would appear that he is not guilty of any such offense. But the point of doing it is simply for the government of the BJP to eliminate one of its most serious potential rivals by rendering him unfit to participate in office. And in a situation like that, you need a judiciary to stand up and do something about it. And indeed, it may well be that India's Supreme Court will take some action in respect of that. But the concern of the people on the streets is that Israel is in danger of ceasing to be a liberal democracy following principles of the rule of law. Now, that is a matter of existential significance. And the word existential is, if I could pick one word in the English language to put on, say, a 3-year vacation, I'm not saying eliminate the word, I would choose existential. We use it constantly and obsessively. I spend a lot of time advising AI companies. They're constantly talking about the existential threat their products cause, which leads me to wonder why they create those products. If they actually believe that, whether they believe it is a separate question, topic for another day. And every crisis nowadays is not really a cool crisis unless you say it's an existential crisis. It's not that Israel would cease to exist if it weren't a liberal democracy, but it would cease to exist in the form of a liberal democracy. And that's of great concern to many, many Israelis. And it's the reason that so many people are on the streets. It's the reason for the intensity. It's the reason for the fear. It's the reason for the concern. Okay. So that's a preliminary account of why so many people are on the streets that I hope gives a greater deal of depth to that question than one might have gotten from the headlines. Now, with the same principle of charity, and that was, let me be clear, a very charitable account of how the protesters are thinking about it, I want to consider the view of the government. And I want to do that not only because my guess is many in the room, not all by any means, and many watching at home, though not all by any means, are probably instinctively on the side of the protesters who, as a sociocultural matter, stand for, broadly speaking, again, this I don't want to oversimplify this, but stand for secular, liberal, democratic values and for the rule of law. And most people who live in the United States like democracy, would prefer that at least our democracy be a secular democracy, and again, not without exception, and definitely think the rule of law is generally a good thing. And then throw in that many of the protesters are self-identified with Israel's high-tech sector. And again, now you have identification with capital and with bourgeois professionalism. And not for nothing, it says the Harvard Hillel, you know, we're not the unique crossing grounds, but the university is at one level, a deep crossing grounds for elite education, bourgeois professionalization and specialization, the rule of law, that's the law school's part, and capital. And capital, okay? So put all those things together and you can imagine that there's a tendency to want to side with the protesters among many, by no means everybody. So what's going on from the standpoint of the government? When you get beyond the oft-repeated claim that Netanyahu is just trying to avoid going to prison at the end of his trial, which he's a human being, I'm sure he doesn't want to go to prison. Well, here you have to provide significant context for the way Israel's democracy has been operating really since the middle of the 1970s. So from 1948, when Israel became a state, until the second half of the 1970s, so just under 30 years, Israel was de facto governed by a series of coalitions that were secular, social democratic, sometimes overtly socialist, dominated by Jews of Ashkenazi, that is to say, European Jewish origin. And the government was dominated by people from the same set of social institutions the same social class that also governed the military, which was and remains one of the most important institutions in Israeli life, and also the judiciary, which wasn't hugely important in that 30-year period, largely because the majority that governed in the Knesset more or less set the agenda for what the country should do. And the members of the same elite who were in the judiciary had no great complaints about that. You know, they handled ordinary legal questions, but they very rarely, if ever, found themselves in deep conflict with the government because they were, you know, to a first approximation, the same sorts of people. What happened in the late 1970s is that in a watershed election, Menachem Begin and the Likud party came into power. And that entailed a range of different transformational features. I'm not going to give you a history lecture about it, but for our purposes, what matters is that the Likud coalition was then, and remains to some degree to this day, a coalition that stood up for Israelis who were not necessarily of European Ashkenazi origin, but Mizrahi, Mediterranean, or, unfortunately, in ordinary English, the literal translation of Mizrahi, which is no longer used because the English terminology changing, is Oriental, which means essentially Jews from Muslim countries, So one can say Mediterranean, that's not precise because they're not all in the Mediterranean, but and Mizrahi is a modern Israeli term. So Jews from that traditionally subordinated sector of Israeli society, which numerically is probably slightly more than half of the Jewish population of Israel, of people who self-identified as not being part of the elite units of the military, the general officer corps, the judiciary, and so forth and so on. of people who lived in the periphery of Israel as opposed to the central big cities. And at that time as well, of people who were involved typically in small business rather than working for big, mostly governmentally controlled entities that dominated at the time. Now, notice that I didn't mention the high-tech sector because there was no real high-tech sector in Israel at the time. A defense industry was beginning to evolve, but the companies were still heavily government-dominated. So this was not Israel as a high-tech nation. This was Israel as social democratic / socialist nation. And I will add to that as well that although the Likud did not itself attract huge numbers of religious voters to begin with, many religious voters were voting for parties that went into coalition with the Likud over the years. And that includes both religious Zionists as well as Haredi, or what people say in English is not a great translation, ultra-Orthodox Jews as well. Both of those groups are, of course, very substantially greater in terms of their numerical representation in Israel today than they were in the late 1970s, as a combination both of their vitality and also of demographics, just having more children. Now, this was a watershed moment because it sent a message to the elites who ran the country that they weren't in charge of the country anymore. And arguably, and this is not my theory, it's the theory of a very prominent Tel Aviv University law professor, the rights revolution that emerged, in which the court began to declare fundamental rights, was a mechanism by which the old elites could consolidate and protect their authority now that they no longer ran the country. Whether that thesis is true or not, it feels true to many, many, many critics of the court's jurisprudence and to many, many critics of the way the Israeli system has classically operated. Over time, some sectors of Israeli elite society have opened themselves up so that there are more people of Mizrahi origin, more people who don't come from the central cities or and the suburbs around them, but from the periphery. But if you look numerically at the leading elite institutions of the country, and this is certainly true of the elite law schools, which tend to produce the judges, there's still wild disproportion relative to the population of who is there. And I would include in that a very substantial disproportionate lack of either national religious or Haredi, ultra-Orthodox representation as well. So from the standpoint of people, many, not by any means all people, who support Netanyahu's efforts to reform the judiciary, they're pushing back against the undemocratic, indeed anti-democratic nature of the Israeli judiciary, which they perceive as a self-conscious force designed to impose secularism and control a wide range of aspects of Israeli life, even where they might have a majority and be able to push for alternative perspectives or points of view. And that, I think, shouldn't be underestimated as a significant motivating factor. And from their perspective, one aspect of the protests, especially as they began, is that they symbolically reflected the power of the old elite Israel. So to give you an example, the fact that high-tech workers initially started protesting represents what the children and grandchildren of the original Ashkenazi elite who ran the country now do, namely they participate in capital and they drive the country. And the form of their threat often was, if you don't do what we want, we'll leave the country and we'll leave you people, as it were, in the lurch. You can't do it without us, to which I think many people's response is, as a matter of fact, we can. But the idea there, again, has a strongly class and privilege inflected idea behind it. More recently, the erstwhile Israeli Minister of Defense, you don't get to use erstwhile all that often, but that was a good one. The erstwhile Israeli Minister of Defense broke ranks with the Netanyahu government. Why? Because he said reservists, and in particular, he had in mind pilots in the Israeli Air Force, were saying they weren't going to show up for their reserve duty. And those pilots, for those of you who haven't spent time in Israel, being an Air Force pilot is the fetishized ideal of Israeli secular elite, and it's gendered, manhood as well. So the idea was, if those pilots aren't going to show up, well then, it's those the final elite has now spoken. And if the pilots take this seriously, then there's a threat to national security. And on that basis, the defense minister made his statement and was fired by Netanyahu. So again, I'm just invoking that to suggest some of the subtle cultural politics that aren't maybe obvious on the surface, but are part of why there are those who still strongly support Netanyahu's reforms. For the most part, I think they are reflecting a sense of exclusion and a belief that if their democratic numbers manifest a majority, they ought to be able to govern as a majority, and that the whole point of judicial review is to block them from doing what they want to do. And this is also hugely significant for the religious population, which fears, much like evangelicals do in the United States, that an activist judiciary that imposes egalitarian rules and principles will declare legal rulings in protection of gay rights in particular, but a range of other cultural hot-button issues as well that don't sit well with their religious beliefs. And so they fear, again, as many evangelicals do in the United States, that an activist judiciary exists to engage in what they would consider reverse religious coercion, or secular coercion, if you will. Okay, so that's an attempt on my part to give a sincere, charitable interpretation of what's going on the other side. So if on one side, what's at stake is democracy in the sense of liberal democracy with an independent judiciary, what's at stake on the other side is democracy in the sense of the majority being able to govern and rule as it wants. And so I think it's important to note that simply because it indicates that it's not as though supporters of these reforms are going to immediately give up their support just because it seems to be politically unpopular. So now let me turn to third and final topic, which is what should we make of this kind of a conflict, which in its essence, as I've just suggested, can be reduced to two competing conceptions of democracy, or maybe one way to think about it is two different forms of the expression of democracy that in certain respects come into conflict with each other. The first thing I want to say is that seen from the standpoint of supporters of the state of Israel, no matter what their politics are within that bound, this conflict is tragic. Now, the reason I said seen from the standpoint of supporters of Israel, it's important to remember there's also another frame to be considered here. And that's the frame of, say, Palestinians or supporters of Palestinians or people who do not believe that Israel is a liberal democracy or is a democracy at all. From their perspective, lots of people going on the streets and saying this is the last straw. If you do this, we won't be a democracy anymore is misguided at best and laughable at worst, because from their perspective, Israel is already not a democracy. And this conflict simply reveals the underlying structure. And the reason so many people are in the streets is simply that it is Jewish Israelis whose interests are at stake, rather than the stake of Palestinians. So it's important to acknowledge that that frame also exists. From the standpoint, though, of supporters of Israel, it is tragic, genuinely tragic, that large numbers of people, not majorities, roughly half, as it were, of the Jewish population of the state of Israel, have reached a point of mutual disagreement that is now issuing in so far not street battles. You still don't have people who support the reforms fighting against the people who do, who oppose the reforms, but it's not clear that that's impossible to conceptualize. And that represents a crisis in any theoretical account of Israeli national unity. Now, you could say, well, that's just because Israel is doing relatively well for itself in its international dimension right now. Most Israelis don't feel they're in immediate, to use that word again, existential threat of being attacked and destroyed from the outside. Israel has managed to effectuate peace deals with several Arab countries, most importantly, the United Arab Emirates, even without doing anything in terms of progress on a deal with the Palestinians. And so in that sense, you could argue that this internal division is the product of how well Israel has been doing for itself. It's a kind of luxury. And you could imagine if, sometime soon, Hezbollah, with the support of Iran, began to shell Israel, people would stop protesting and there might be some return to some sort of unity. But that would be temporary. That would be temporary because the fault lines in the country are significant. And with each day that this conflict continues, those fault lines deepen. And in this sense, Netanyahu, the man, is just a proxy for these fault lines. And to me, it seems unlikely that if he will, well, eventually he will pass from the political scene because he's also human and we all die eventually. Even though he will pass from the political scene eventually, by one means or another, it seems very unlikely to me that the depth of sentiment that's clearly felt on both sides is likely to immediately disappear. So this is a genuine fissure in Israeli society, and that fissure is tragic. A further reason why it's tragic is that the demographics of Israel are slowly but surely shifting, and they're shifting in favor of more or less the religious population of Israelis, simply because of birth rates. I mean, there are people also who choose to become religious, but the real driver of demographic difference is birth rates. And seen from that perspective, over time, this conflict is likely not to go away if many young religious people conceptualize their interests as being more or less those represented by the Netanyahu government. Now, to say that something is tragic is not to say that the game is over by any stretch of the imagination. And that leads to the question of, is there a way out of this? Is there a way out of this conflict? Now, if you look up, I mean, you can't exactly look this up, but if you were to look up Constitutional Crisis 101, it would tell you that constitutional crises are typically only resolved in one of two ways. They're either resolved by the absolute victory of one side, typically using some kind of force, bad result for everybody all the time, or they're resolved by compromise. Now, compromise is a word that is fraught, let's say. When I was at dinner just before coming over here, I had an intense conversation with my 17-year-old son, and I guess if you say I had a conversation with my 17-year-old son, you don't have to add intense, at least not if your last name is Feldman, over whether it was even, in his view, morally acceptable to even talk about compromise. And he made his view extremely clear that even to talk about compromise would amount to opting for the moral legitimacy of one side over the other. And I, as usual is the case, he has a perspective that's a reasonable perspective. I don't think that in this case, refusing to talk about compromise is very productive, unless you want to see the rift in Israeli society deepen and extend and see Israel pay the price for that, which again, I want to acknowledge there is a frame from which that would be highly desirable. So any other alternative is one where one side tries to impose its will by force, and that tends not to be very durable over time. So realistically, what we're talking about is a possibility of compromise. This is not going to be easy because there are many different moving parts, and also because mass protest movements like the one that's been going on are not fully controlled by any particular set of political leadership. So you could have a compromise and lots of people might stay on the streets. On the other side, you do have Bibi Netanyahu, who is capable of negotiating on behalf of his coalition, but he also is constrained, substantially constrained, because if he loses his coalition, he's back out of office, and out of office, he has even fewer tools at his disposal to also avoid going to prison. So he has a double reason to stay in office, as a politician and as a human who doesn't want to go to prison. So the negotiations that will be possible to imagine are going to have to involve subtle and complex deals on probably multiple dimensions. Central will be how the justices are actually selected. And I had one of my very smart colleagues at the law school today, who himself is Israeli originally, say this is an absolutely inappropriate thing. You can never compromise on that. It's absolutely crucial to have this independent at the judiciary. But that point of view essentially says no compromise. And again, there is a view that on the protester side that says, let's not compromise. Let's just stick with this. We've shown how to bring down the government. And if we can bring down the government, then we're going to win. And Bibi will go to prison and this problem will go away. I think that's incredibly short-sighted as a view. But I understand it. I understand the instinct of feeling that. So that's one dimension on which negotiation will have to happen. Another will probably have to be what are the conditions on which the Israeli High Court is actually authorized or empowered to strike down laws? And I don't mean how many votes among the judges it would take. I mean the much more fundamental underlying question. Does there have to be a legal proposition that explicitly authorizes them to do so? If so, how many people would have to vote for that proposition? How would it operate? Now, I know people who think this is a great moment for an Israeli constitution to emerge. I mean, wouldn't that be fun? It would be amazing if that were possible, but constitutions, strictly speaking, require a supermajority. And Israel has trouble holding on to even a majority. So it's hard to picture a scenario where a supermajority emerges. But you might be able to get a compromise and agreement on some narrower set of propositions about when judicial review could be undertaken. And that might actually leave the entire edifice substantially more legitimate than it was previously, which would be good for the protesters, while simultaneously weakening the possibility of the court legitimately overturning legislation passed by this coalition government, which would be good for the coalition government. Okay? Whether Netanyahu goes to prison might also be something that would obliquely make its way into negotiations, because people are human. So I think there is a scenario for some sort of negotiation. And I just want to close by saying why it would be important and valuable from all sides to get that negotiation done. From the standpoint of the government, the protesters have now shown that they can do a great deal to come close to shutting down the country. That's a serious issue for the government. From the standpoint of the protesters, everything they do that is a successful protest is also a script that the other side could follow if they were in power and they wanted to do something that the other side didn't want them to do. And that is up to and including refusal to serve in the reserves, general strike or general strike-like things, shutting down the airport, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a genuine risk from that other perspective as well. A country in which each side has the capacity to veto the democratic action of the government by going to the streets is a country headed for political disorder. And that's not in the interest of anybody. It's definitely not in the interests of capital, which likes order on the streets to the extent humanly possible. So each side has something to gain here. But more fundamentally, I don't think either side has much to gain from perpetuating a worldview which is a zero sum between roughly half of Jewish Israelis on one side and roughly half of Jewish Israelis on the other. That way of seeing the world is going to be deeply, deeply debilitating to the country. And since we in the United States are not utterly unfamiliar with polarizing tendencies of that sort, we can relate to that. But I would argue that American polarization is actually shallower, even than the kind of polarization that we're talking about in Israel, because there is still, in the United States, still enough overlap in terms of basic values commitments and basic institutional commitments to enable Americans, I believe, over time to overcome their divisions. Israelis have the ability to do that too, but every day the cost of their doing that is getting just a little bit higher. And so I think there is a deep incentive on both sides to compromise. Does that mean there will be a compromise? If probabilities were always successful, they would be 100% probability. So you can't say that. All you can say is that there are strong incentives on both sides to compromise and look hopefully from that frame, within that frame to the future and hope for that to occur. Thanks for listening, and I'm really eager to hear questions and challenges.
Thank you. Noah. We've got a lot of people in the room and a lot of questions. This mic is not to amplify your voice within the room, but so that our online audience can hear you. So we'll start over here.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. You mentioned that the protesters might see what they are doing as a playbook for the government/religious right coalition that you're describing, but aren't the institutions really asymmetric here? You mentioned the airport shutting down. That's from the labor union, which is decidedly leaning one way politically. It's true of the high-tech industry as well. I mean, are there institutions aligned with the current coalition, the religious right, that have the capability to shut down general society in the way that's happening right now? And I mean, could that—
That's a great question. I mean, the Israeli military is complex and in a complex demographic state. Some of the elite parts of the military, I mentioned the pilots, tend secular, but combat units don't any longer. They once did and they don't to the same degree any longer. The General Officer Corps is undergoing a historic process of transformation. I'm looking at Avishai Ben Sasson Gordis here, who's just finished an amazing dissertation about militarism, and it's not squarely about Israel, but he knows a huge amount about militarism and the state of the Israeli military. So there's complexity of that too. So the military is probably the single most significant. But you also don't have to rely on the labor union in its entirety if you can convince ordinary people not to show up for their jobs. And the ordinary people come from many different political perspectives, and there are plenty of jobs in the country which are necessary infrastructure jobs for the country that are disproportionately filled by, broadly speaking, right of center, Likud and other supporters. So yeah, there are plenty of parts of the country. They're not the ones where capital is focused, but it's easy to shut down a smallish country without that as well. And by the way, just to put my cards on the table, I mean, it may be impossible to imagine it in the near future, but imagine in a more distant future a scenario where an Israeli governing coalition actually signed a peace accord with some Palestinian representation agreeing on the creation of a Palestinian state. Again, it looks implausible in the foreseeable immediate future, but imagine that happening. What I mean is there's now a script for how a substantial part of the population, it wouldn't have to be a majority, maybe it would only have to be 25% or 30%, could simply block that from happening by mass action. And so, you know, this is an iterative game. Politics is an iterative game where everybody learns, and that's significant.
Hi, thank you. When you talked about the people who fought the reform, you described it as class and elite conflict, but you haven't mentioned the settler movement. You haven't mentioned Kohelet, which became elite no less than the Mapai, like old left, which nothing of it exists anymore, actually. So what do you make of that and their role in the...
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I could speak for many, many, many hours about the settler movement. It's hugely important and very fascinating and complex. This settler movement has greater representation at greater senior positions in this government than ever before. Both through Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. Clearly, the settler movement cares a lot about restricting the court because the court has, on occasion, intervened on behalf of imposing limits on settlement in various respects and in various ways. Whether the settler movement is elite is a complicated thing. The definition of elites is always complex in any social context. I think that most people in the settler movement don't self-identify as elites relative to the society, but it's something that would be worthy to discuss. As for Kohelet, which is a think tank, primarily US funded, of kind of neoconservative bent, for sure, it is an elite institution, providing the entrepreneurial thought leadership for this proposal and this movement. But it's not putting boots on the ground. It didn't elect Netanyahu. It provided some ideas. And, that can happen under all political situations and circumstances. The people who propose ideas might not be the same as the people who are on the streets in support of those ideas.
Can you elaborate on the aspects of corruption? Because the three first implementation of the reform, one, to bring back to the government someone that was convicted 3 times. The second one is to protect the prime minister who is now being charged. And there are more of these. And the third one is to allow that prime minister to get money from anyone, basically, for their own protection.
Thank you for that. So corruption is probably the most protean word in our general political vocabulary. The framers of the US Constitution were obsessed with corruption. They thought the British order had become corrupt. They were afraid of their own system becoming corrupted. Corruption drove civil service reform already in the late 18th century, early 19th century in the UK. And subsequently, I mean, it's a rich and protean word. My colleague Larry Lessig at the law school says that the entire US political system is fundamentally corrupt because we allow money to be spent, private money to be spent to elect candidates. And seen it from a certain perspective, Larry is dead on correct, right? You could imagine that from a lot of countries in the world's perspective, the idea that we have this system is fundamentally corrupt. Then there are cases where most people are prepared to say that something is corrupt. That is elected politician taking money behind closed doors in exchange for performing some service. On the more complicated area is what happens to someone who's been convicted of a crime, punished for it, and now is elected to office. Whether such a person should be permanently disenfranchised and unable to participate not only in voting, but in participation in government is a question that different democracies take different perspectives on. And Israel's, in a sense, been on both sides of that, right? Because there have both been exclusions of people like Aryeh Deri from office, and also re-inclusions under specially enacted legislation. So I think what I would say about that is that it's easy to understand and sympathize with a point of view that says this is corruption. Netanyahu is on trial. He hasn't been convicted for charges of corruption. And after all, what is the point of packing the judiciary and so forth and so on, other than to enable the facilitation of that corruption? I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. I can hear it loud and clear. And I can also see the perspective that says the legal system targets, and this is shades of the United States, the legal system targets people based in part on their political points of view. And once they're convicted and have paid their debt to society, they should be able to participate if the public elects them. Doesn't happen to be my point of view, but it's a point of view that seems to me plausible within the standpoint of general democratic values.
Thank you. So something that I'm noticing when I'm looking at different reactions that are happening now, and especially in the last day or two, is throwing around of certain words, such as globalists and elitists and things like that, that traditionally in the United States and outside of Israel are clearly seen as dog whistles for anti-Semitism. And so I'm wondering how that fits in with the Jewish state, especially when it's the religious right using these terms against people that some people consider varying degrees of Jewish. Like, how does that all come together? Because it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it didn't just start recently. That's been in Israeli right-wing discourse for at least a decade aggressively. And I think there are probably, Abishai, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are even hints of it 15 years ago. But it's certainly become increasingly popular. I think the short answer is that Jewishness is contested. And even in Israel, quote unquote, especially in Israel, what it counts as being Jewish in the right way, by which every single Jew means the same thing, Jewish the way I am, is highly contested. And there's a willingness sometimes to condemn people who do their Jewishness, perform their Jewishness, or live their Jewishness in a different way as doing it wrong. And so, the critique, and much like anti-Semitism itself, which has this incredible protean character, where Jews can always be faulted for being X and simultaneously for being not X, right? So in the classic anti-Semitic tropes, Jews are simultaneously the most globalized cosmopolitan, people, and simultaneously the most narrowly self-interested, solidarity expressing people, right? Jews are the ultimate, in the same anti-Semitic tropes, Jews are the ultimate manifestations of international capital, and Jews are the ultimate manifestations of international communism and Bolshevism, right? I mean, all of these, this is the history of anti-Semitism, at least in the modern era. These stereotypes have sat in these nested pairs next to each other. So big shock, discourse cannot be narrowly cabined. And so those who would criticize Israelis who are consider themselves liberal Democrats might take the opportunity to say that their liberal democracy is globalizing and cosmopolitan. That includes criticisms of organizations that take money, God forbid, from American Jews, which is kind of rich considering the history of the Jewish state and its great efforts to obtain the support of American Jews, right? So yeah, those kinds of narratives do emerge within the Israeli context. They don't function as anti-Semitic in exactly the same way that they would be anti-Semitic if expressed elsewhere. But are they redolent of anti-Semitic tropes? Sure. And let me be really clear about the other side too. The anti-religious rhetoric that one hears, not only privately, but publicly from many secular Israelis, is itself frequently, let's just say, it's not something one would prefer to hear from anybody, and one would be very upset about it if one heard it from someone who wasn't Jewish, right? It would sound itself like classic anti-Semitism, and it can go pretty deep. I mean, when it's against the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox community, it sometimes becomes pseudo-biological, which again, talk about crazy. I mean, it's hard to imagine something crazier than, Ashkenazi Jews, the people whose 23andMe says 99.99, which God help us, mine does. I really felt like I lost when I got the 23andMe back. I was like that anyway. But for someone with that genetic makeup to be criticizing the biophysical capacities of another Jew is pretty bad. So what you're saying is true. It's bad, and unfortunately, it's not restricted to one side either. I'm tempted to say something about what happened. Well, I'm not going to say it. I'll save it for my book.
Hi, Professor Feldman. Thank you so much for putting on this event. So the last couple of years, I've been thinking a lot about minority rule and judicial review and how they relate, especially when it comes to the US, where we have a Supreme Court that doesn't at all reflect the will of the majority. And watching these protests happen in Israel, obviously, as a secular, socially liberal person, I'm like, wow, this is horrible. But then I'm thinking they're protesting because they're, they think the majority is not reflective on the court, kind of like how the left is complaining about that here, where the majority is also not reflected on the court. So, I was wondering if you could opine on like minority rule and how that relates to judicial review, because I think a lot of people on the left are starting to become a little bit more hesitant about judicial review. Certainly I am, because I think that majority rule wanted to do anything. Yeah, well, exactly. Majority rule is better than minority rule, right? And so
I think your question is very well put. I mean, look, here in the United States, there's a contradiction for the median secular liberal democratic, Elizabeth Warren supporting American Jew, who is horrified by the current Supreme Court in the United States and its configuration, and is thinking suddenly, maybe now that the other side has 5 or 6 votes, maybe this judicial review thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. And then looks at Israel and says, judicial review, it's existential that there be aggressive judicial review. I mean, so that's tricky. And by the way, flip, it's the other way too. If you're a strong supporter of the current US Supreme Court, and there are some in the American Jewish community who are, then it's a little awkward to be exercising a powerful critique of minoritarian judicial review. Now, if you wanted to be super technical, you could note that Israeli judicial review rests on a thinner reed of constitutional logic than does US constitutional review. But you could also say that given where Israel is in its history as a country and its state as a democracy, its status as a democracy, Israel might need powerful judicial review at this point in its history more than the United States does. These turn into debates about what is really the hardest problem in my day job, which is constitutional law. Namely, can anyone sustain a genuine belief in either the benefits or the disadvantages of judicial review when that person's side loses the majority on the court? And historically, to a first approximation, almost nobody can withstand the test. Judicial restraint was invented by Felix Frankfurter and other liberals, because he was a strong liberal at the time, in the teens and 20s, because of the conservative libertarian property protecting Supreme Court. Then, after Roosevelt's presidency, liberals eventually got a majority on the court, and they became the activist side, and conservatives picked up the anti-judicial review judicial restraint position, and now they've dropped it. And sure enough, liberals are going to pick it up again. It's not a pretty picture if your day job is trying to give some coherence to constitutional law doctrine. There are a few people, Chief Justice Roberts, stuck with his judicial, his centrist Frankfurtarian judicial restraint view. Not that he fully effectuates it, but he does believe in it. Neither did Frankfurter perfectly effectuate it either. There are people like that, and those people usually end up friendless. They end up with both sides hating them, which is what happened to Frankfurter. The right could never forgive him for having, been a huge New Dealer and supporter of liberal causes, and the left could never forgive him for, they called it turning conservative, because he just refused to join the judicial rights revolution. And Chief Justice Roberts is in the process of going through that too. So add in an extra dimension of constitutional review in another country, and you multiply as you multiply dimensions, you multiply opportunities for hypocrisy. So I applaud you for trying to think hard about it. It's hard.
Can you talk about this a little bit about the situation, the hypothetical situation of these laws being passed, and then the Supreme Court exercising its right of its erstwhile right of judicial review and striking them down, and then this ping-ponging effect, and what would be the most likely outcome?
Yeah, so what you're describing is the gaming out of a constitutional crisis. And a constitutional crisis, strictly speaking, exists, at least in my definition, when there are two sides, each of which claims to be correctly interpreting the Constitution, each of whose interpretation mandates opposite forms of conduct by certain government employees, and you don't know what's going to happen next. Right? What makes it a crisis, by my definition, is that you don't know what's going to happen next. If everyone knows more or less what's going to happen, it's a moment in constitutional life, but it's not a crisis. So the first point is that there's genuine uncertainty about what would happen. So the law passes, and the Israeli High Court strikes down that law as unconstitutional. Right? Now, in the first instance, that might not precipitate an immediate crisis if there was no justice that needed to be chosen in exactly that moment. Right? What you need is a real world case where there's some government official, some bureaucrat, military official, you name it, who's being told by one boss, the prime minister, do X, and by another boss, the Supreme Court or the High Court, do Y. And when that person doesn't know what to do, then you're in the crisis. Now, what happens in such crises? Sometimes they're resolved by force, as I mentioned earlier, right? Sometimes the side with the weapons wins. The court has no weapons. It only has the power of persuasion. However, there are occasional outlying cases where the relevant governmental officials would potentially side, or some of the relevant government officials would potentially side with the court. The worst case scenario is some of the relevant officials with guns side with the prime minister and some with the court. And that's what people are talking about, or what they ought to be talking about, when they say there is a danger of civil war. Now, to be clear, I do not believe Israel is in danger of civil war in the ordinary sense of the term. I don't think you would have armed militias that, that the IDF would break into parts, and militias of different kinds would form, and they would fight for control over neighborhoods and blocks, kind of Lebanese civil war style. I think that's vanishingly unlikely. Nobody really has very much to gain from it. And Israel isn't so configured in such a way for that to work very well in most instances. But there is the possibility of showdowns involving some sort of force, and those are a game of chicken. They're about who will blink first. Measured historically, courts don't do very well in these things because courts don't have anybody who listens to them who carries guns. So but that's not, so historically, if I were the court, I'd be nervous about that reality. But you could imagine a court saying, we've got nothing to lose. We're going to issue these orders and see what happens. Of course, what they would have to lose is that in a situation like that, they could themselves be arrested and jailed. And if someone sided with them, if the military sided with them, now you're in a situation of what is usually called a constitutional coup d'etat. If someone goes in and carries away the prime minister at gunpoint, and that happens in some countries under some circumstances, that's a constitutional coup d'etat. And then you have to ask whether it was lawful or not. And whether you think it was a legitimate coup d'etat or an illegitimate one just depends on what your answer is to the underlying question of, was the Supreme Court's decision correct? Right? So that's the normative side, the who's right side, and the descriptive side is you don't really know who's going to win. You can just make predictions. based on what is likely to happen in a face-off. And other institutions can get involved, and they can go home and do nothing. They can set things on fire. There's a whole range of things that they can do. But if enough things had been set on fire in these protests to endanger, daily national security, it's pretty clear that the government would have brought out troops and would have ordered troops into the streets to do something about it. And the question is, would those troops obey? And that's an ongoing question, and you don't need all the troops to obey, you just need some of the troops to obey. That's grim, I know, but thank you for asking it. It's important to think about it.
Could you speak any more about how the Supreme Court decides the law is unconstitutional, not its authority, but how it says that this law specifically is wrong and needs to be overturned?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the Israeli court has classically done it is to point to language in specific legislation, the basic laws, that it says is being contradicted by the given action or law, and to use that as the basis for unconstitutionality. One could imagine, they haven't really done this, one could imagine the court going back to first principles and saying the Declaration of Independence of Israel says we have to be democratic. So if this law makes us not democratic, then it can't be legitimate, so we strike it down. There's also non-constitutional review, which is sometimes called administrative law review. This is way too technical, and I'm going to lose everybody in the audience, everybody at home. But basically, that's a circumstance where the court in Israel would say that the government's action was, quote unquote, extremely unreasonable and strike it down on those grounds. As you can imagine, extreme unreasonableness is a very discretionary doctrine.
Thank you. So one small comment and then one question. The comment is more of a news. Probably haven't heard, but last night was actually characterized by significant street violence. A reporter of the Israeli CNN, Reshet 13, is actually still hospitalized after being attacked by the pro side. And there are dozens of accounts of individuals throughout Tel Aviv who've been attacked. So that's just, it actually has happened.
That's very, very upsetting. And as you say, I didn't know that.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
I guess my question is sort of, because you're an expert on this, it's hard for me to understand sort of why you think the Israeli judicial review process is so different from the American one, when to my understanding, Barak started this after the 1992 Chok Zchut Adam V'Chiruto, which in Section 8 specifically says that all governments of all bodies of government are subjected to this law. And people who've written it, who were both from the Likud and from Avodah, have sort of expressed both at the time and since then that when they wrote this Piska 8 meant that the parties can check each other to prevent them from sort of overstepping this law. And in fact, almost all of the cases that the Israeli Supreme Court has taken to intervene have almost exclusively been on this one law. So
and
why is that
there
so
haven't even
different?
been that many. I think there are 22
Yeah,
cases.
exactly.
Only. And yeah. So you're right that this basic law on human dignity and freedom is framed in such a way that it could have been interpreted by the court, as indeed it was, to say that it trumped all other legislation. But there are a couple of challenges from an ordinary lawyer's perspective. The first is it was just passed by the Knesset as a regular law. Wasn't supermajority. And it's a general principle of legal interpretation in essentially every legal system that a legislature can't bind itself in a future legislature, right? So if Congress passes a law, it can repeal that law. And if the same number of people voted for the next law, which is in contradiction to it, ordinarily, again, a standard principle is that the later in time does supersede the first one. So there's a question of on what authority would the Knesset just say, we're passing a law now, and this time we really mean it, and any future Knesset can't subsequently amend it. Now, you're right that they could do so by saying that, and maybe that suffices. They said it obliquely in this instance. And that's a genuine, I'm not arguing that those opinions are totally preposterous. As I said, they built up meaningful legitimacy from their supporters. I just mean that from the time that they were initially decided, there were vocal minorities, sometimes even on the court, expressing skepticism of this interpretive mechanism. And in the general public, judicial review didn't achieve the kind of legitimacy within Israel that it has achieved in most other liberal democracies. You could sort of analogize it in a way to the Roe versus Wade decision, which, unlike a lot of other constitutional decisions in the US, which have come to be widely supported, even the Obergefell decision seems to have achieved a good deal of support. But Roe v. Wade never did achieve the kind of broad legitimacy that its supporters hoped that it would achieve. It remained controversial, notwithstanding that many people still thought it was the right outcome. And that made it easier for it to be overturned ultimately by the Supreme Court. So the analogy is just to say that there was not the kind of broad societal acceptance of the phenomenon of judicial review that there was within the legal profession. So that's the response that I would make.
Even though it was signed by both sides of the opposition in a joint government in 92.
Yes. Yes. But again, the idea that, well, two of the leading political parties, they didn't represent everybody, but two of the leading political parties were both behind something means it has constitutional weight. Like that's not an ordinary principle of constitutional law. Right? I mean, who the parties were is a contingent fact, again, under ordinary juridical standards. Now, again, within the Israeli context, Barak's court was making the argument that since we don't have a constitution, let's find some indicia of constitution-like features and ascribe that to it. And again, that was successful within some legal community, but not fully successful on the outside. And I'll just add that the law to change how the justices are selected doesn't implicate that basic law. So if the Supreme Court or the High Court were to strike it down, they would have to have some other basis than the basic law.
We'll take one or two final questions.
Yeah. So all the so-called reform is embedded not in a regular law, but I think you just touched upon this now. They're embedded in the basic laws. The court it declared that it has the authority to disqualify, but it didn't do that yet. And it's not an accident that all of the reforms are in the basic law,
yeah,
which means this is the higher norm. And I wonder what's your and now it has to operate on this doctrine of non-constitutional amendment, unconstitutional constitutional amendment.
Yeah,
and because this is what is going to be.
Yeah. So for those non-lawyers in the room, it will sound weird. It's okay. It will sound weird to say that you can amend the Constitution in a way that is itself unconstitutional, right? Because if it's an amendment, you're supposed to be changing it. But there is a doctrine that some high courts in some countries around the world, a handful, have adopted, according to which the court gets to decide that some amendments are so deviant from the basic constitutional norms that you can't make them. And you can imagine this is pretty controversial among constitutional scholars, because if the people are supposed to be the ultimate source of authority, right, which is what these liberal democracies all claim, and if the people, and often a supermajority of the people, have amended the Constitution, to say that they can't do that is to say that there's an authority greater than the people, and that authority must be found somewhere, and perhaps it sounds like it's being found in the court that so interprets it. So it's a tricky doctrine to make out. And there are some constitutions that say explicitly that some of their amendments are unamendable. The Ottoman Constitution, the post-Ottoman Turkish Constitution had that. The support for Ataturk and the secularism of the state was made unamendable. And if you really have something unamendable and enough people want to amend it, at some point that leads to a crisis. That's sort of how that tends to play out. So unconstitutional constitutional amendments are a really interesting, hard problem. The idea that there would be a national crisis over such a thing is pretty astonishing, since it's basically a highly technical question of, political theory and constitutional interpretation, which is why I'm suggesting that what's really behind it is not so much the technical issue, the lawyer's question, as the popular sense on the one side that democracy itself is in doubt, and the sense on the other side that a group of people are trying to, of which the court is the representative, are trying to block the Democratic majority from what it wants to do. And technically speaking, both sides could be correct.
Thank you again for the talk, Professor. I was thinking about your third section on compromise, and in reflecting on your analysis, I thought I was hearing that identity and political position on this issue are fairly fused. But I was also thinking that it seems like a bit of a political struggle to make an effective and winnable coalition within Israel. So it seems like there's some dynamism at play there. And then I was also thinking that even within these identities, there are also dynamics and intersections there too. I'm thinking about like older voters, younger voters on either side, gender, and other things like that. Does that offer avenues for compromise, or are those like cross-cutting dynamics across these parties ways forward?
That's an incredibly subtle and thoughtful question. First, I think you're right that although my presentation tended towards the reification of those identities, that's mostly because of the way that the discourse has emerged in recent weeks. This is a very narrowly divided society in which coalitions are formed and have been formed and can be formed again that are cross-cutting in various respects. Religious, secular, right-left is one of the classic cross-cutting ones in the Israeli context. Age might be a factor, although it seems that demographically, younger voters in this most recent election skewed substantially to the right. In that sense, the Israeli electorate looks very, very different from the way that the US electorate looks, where if it were all up to the folks your age, it would be a much more liberal government. In Israel, it seems to be the other way, which is quite striking. So that could be cross-cutting, but maybe in a surprising fashion. I do think that compromise remains a real possibility. I really do. I just think that the farther you go down the road of violence and protest and counter-violence, the harder it gets for people to break out of their identities. Identities tend to harden the more intense the conflict becomes. That's certainly what I saw in Iraq. It's why it's important that basic order be maintained. Because once that starts to go, people really dig in for a very complex set of both psychological and also self-interest reasons, because you want somebody to protect you. Israel's not at that stage yet.
Out of Rahmanis, for the people who are watching in Israel, where it's 4:25 in the morning, we'll have one final question here.
Professor, what is the role, you've discussed the constitutionalism in Israel, what is the role of the basic laws in Israel as they relate to this? And in particular, from the perspective of the government, I think two of the provisions that they want to incorporate, one is the fact that there seems to be this hatred of the basic laws as being enshrined as almost quasi-constitutional, but the other is the fact that they don't want the basic laws, if something is determined to be a basic law, to be able to be overturned on judicial review. So do the basic laws play a
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Jojo. You're right. And the reason for the inherent tension there is, from the standpoint of the current government, they don't want the previously passed basic laws, which have been used by the court to effectuate classically liberal results, to continue to have that effect. But to the extent they're able to enact their own basic laws going forward, they don't want the court blocking those basic laws from going into effect on the grounds that their new basic laws are insufficiently liberal democratic and are too nationalist. So they want both because they're human, and that's what politics is like. So you're right to sense a tension there. I mean, the irony, to close on this, is that the basic laws were always described as kind of paragraphs that would eventually go into a constitution. But now they are at the center of a real constitutional crisis. So, their under specificity, which was historically seen as one of their virtues, now arguably looks like it's a meaningful cost associated with that. I just want to express gratitude to everybody who's still here for wonderful and thoughtful questions, and to Donnie and to Hillel, and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you to Professor Feldman for sticking around for an hour and a half for that incredibly thoughtful conversation, talk, and answering all of these wonderful questions. Next week, not here, but online, on April 3rd, Monday at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting Liam Najani, who's the first Arab-Israeli Rhodes Scholar, so from Rhodes Scholar to Rhodes Scholar. So that'll be online. Look for the link for that. I also want to express our gratitude to the Harvard Students Law Student Association and the Julis-Rabinowitz Program for helping to promote tonight's event. We had well over 800 people joining live, and there will be a recording on our Facebook page and later on our website. Thank you all, both here in person and online. I wish you all a wonderful evening.